at Berkeley, which he has for a number of years, but he's taught at most of the great universities around the world. And he's rather unusual, certainly in these times, of just having an immense range of his work. He's done very detailed empirical studies of rural institutional issues in developing countries. He's also an international trade theorist. He's a growth theorist. And he, particularly in recent years, he's done a lot of political economy work, which I think the discussion tonight would fall in that category. Pranab used to be the chief editor of Journal of Development Economics, the main development journal. He's been on the editorial boards of many of the other top economics journals. He's written a dozen books, and I had the honor of having him as my teacher some years ago. One thing that always struck me, particularly in Professor Bardhan's lectures, was the great precision of his ideas. And one thing that was made quite tangible, was to come into his lecture, he would always seem to sweep into the room within a minute of the hour with perfectly typewritten lecture notes, which I never managed myself. And as the second hand would sweep up to 12, he would start talking. And there'd be a lot of exciting things that would go on right until the last minute of the lecture. But now we can hear some from the man himself.
Thank you, John, for those kind remarks. And thank you all for a Friday afternoon to come and listen to me. It's a great pleasure to come to Portland. I have not come here in a long time. I passed through the airport, but not entered the city. There's a lot of talk in the media, both print media and electronic media, about these rising giants, China and India, two largest countries of the world, containing 2.5 billion people. Much of the media attention to these two countries is in terms of what the rise of these two giants implies for the rest of the world, particularly for the West. Here now you see lots of books about the rise of the East, decline of the West, etc. My talk is not about that. I just want to make it clear. My talk is about what's happening inside these two large countries, containing these 2.5 billion people. So it's not about the implications of the rise of China and India for the global economy, it's for their people inside those economies. The other thing I should tell you right at the beginning, that what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with some very descriptive materials. I will have two or three charts, mostly descriptive materials about the last quarter century, things happening to the Chinese and Indian economy. And then I'll go into somewhat more controversial political economy stuff. In particular, I probably will have time to cover, even if briefly, only two topics of political economy. One is about the nature of capitalism as it is developing in these two countries. And the other, which always interests people whenever one talks about China and India together, is the complex, in my judgment, rather complex relationship between democracy, or lack of it, and development. So those are the two main political economy issues I'm going to end with. But beginning with some descriptive materials. What I have is a PDF document. If you don't mind, I'm not going to use most of the slides that I have. The slides I have, essentially, I gave this in 2 lectures in London School of Economics. So I have all the slides, but I'll have time to only show you some of the slides. I'm going to skip sometimes many paragraphs in a page, so I'm using a PDF. So you'll see me quickly moving from one paragraph and then skipping some to some others, and then skipping many pages. Okay, so let me start with a historical chart. Let me go. This is probably going to be too large. Let me see if I can get the right font. Yeah, this should be okay. So what I have here, these towers are proportion of world income in different historical periods. So let me start in the earliest point of time here, 1820. This big chunk, that's China. In 1820, 33%, 1/3 of world income was generated by China. This is India, 16% in 1820. So these two countries together had generated almost half of world income. In contrast, this little yellow is Japan. Littler pale blue is United States. And this purple or whatever color you call it, 17%, is the four large countries of Western Europe. So in 1820, to repeat, China and India constituted almost half of world income. I'm not going to go over all this time period. Let me jump 130 years, jump to 1950. The two countries together cover or generated 9% of world income, from 49% to 9%. Huge drop in the proportion of world income generated by these two countries. Of course, a lot of things happened, rather traumatic things happened in the two countries between 1820 and 1950, including what I would call rather unpleasant encounters of both countries with international powers. Let me leave it at that. So this is Japan again. So United States is by now 27% of world income. Four large countries of Europe, 19, and India and China together 9%. So let me jump now to a future point, 2025. This, of course, is based on projection. By the way, if anyone is interested in the source of the data, is generated by out of research by the late economic historian Angus Madison. So his projection for 2025 is that China will have 25% of world income, India 11%, the two together will have 36%, little above 1/3. So it's not the half of world income. In 200 years, China and India will have a partial restoration of what it was in 1820 in terms of proportion of world income, but it's a significant restoration from the 9% in 1950. And of course, United States will decline from 27 in 1950 to 18% in 2025, and four large countries of Western Europe 10%, etc. So that gives you some historical perspective about these two giants, the rising giants. Now, obviously, much of the enthusiasm or the excitement about the rise of these two countries, at least economic rise, has to do with the very fast rate of economic growth in the last quarter century. Now, of course, in this, China has really surpassed anybody else. In fact, if you look at per capita income, in 1870s as well as in 1970s, India's per capita income was higher than that of China. In in 1870s as well as in 1970s. But since around 1990, China's per capita income has shot way above India's. So roughly, if you take the last quarter century or 3 decades, the average annual rate of growth in India has been about, rate of growth of per capita income has been around 4% in India. China, not nearly, has been much above, but if you, some people think there is a bit of overstatement in the Chinese rates of growth, but even if you account for that, there's no question in my mind that the Chinese rate of per capita income growth in the last 3 decades has been at least twice that of India. Let me now tell you a little bit about the composition of this growth. That's quite interesting. Because what I just told you about the overall national income. Now, you will hear this all the time, that China's growth has been largely manufacturing centered. In fact, some people think China is now the manufacturing workshop, the manufacturing center of the world, which of course, any department store you walk in, most products, the back of it, it says made in China. In fact, in India, in festival times, you know, the Hindu religion has thousands of gods and goddesses. So different festivals, there's festival about worshipping some god or goddesses. And around that time, even in the streets, they will sell you little idols of the particular god or goddess. And if you take these figures, just turn it around, quite often they're made in China. The Indian gods who have been worshipped. Now, something that I should tell you, and let me, before I go into some qualification, by the way, in my descriptive materials that I'm going to go over, quite often I'm going to emphasize that I'm going to qualify some of the conventional wisdom. And even in this matter of manufacturing, China being the manufacturing center of the world, I'm going to qualify this a little bit. But before that, let me say, the corresponding story about India is not about manufacturing. It's about the service sector. The service sector, particularly we hear stories about software, information technology, business processing, etc. Most of the companies, there's a telephone number you call for any problem that you're having, any product, and quite often you're not aware that you're really talking to somebody in Bangalore or somebody in Gurgaon, in North India. And they try their best to hide the accent. So Indian growth is service center, Chinese growth in manufacturing center. But let me qualify both of these, both parts of conventional wisdom regarding that. Yes, there's no doubt China has had a phenomenal growth in manufacturing. But economists would distinguish between growth in total value of output and growth in total value added, which is, the difference is that the value added is after deducting for costs for materials, spare parts, components, and things like that. Now, first of all, in terms of manufacturing value added, China is not yet the center of the world, manufacturing world. China will get there, no doubt, in my mind, but not yet. So what kind of numbers? So in 2009, of the world total manufacturing value added, China contributed about 15%, 1-5, which is about the same as Japan. United States, 24%. EU, European Union, about 20%. So in manufacturing value added, the largest contributor is yet not of China's, but China will get there, I'm sure. The other thing I should tell you, a lot of the people think that the Chinese growth saying manufacturing has been unparalleled. Again, one has to qualify this a little bit. If I may skip to another chart I have. So let me show you this particular chart, which is largely the manufacturing sector. It's the secondary sector, which includes manufacturing, mining, etc. So I have 4 curves there for 4 Asian countries. Manufacturing growth rates, manufacturing value-added growth rates in the first 25 years since the growth spurt started. So the growth spurt started. So the countries are China. This is China. This is Taiwan. This is Korea. And this is Japan. So growth spurt started in this calculation in Japan around 1950 or 55. In Taiwan, 65. Sorry, in Korea, it's 60, Taiwan, 65, and China, 1980, for this diagram. So you can see the growth in value added, in manufacturing value added, the highest rate of growth all along in the first 25 years of growth spurt is South Korea. Then it's Taiwan. Then it is China. And this is Japan. So China outpaced Japan in the first 25 years after some period. Having said that, let me hasten to add that of course China is much larger than these 3 countries put together. So even if the value-added rate of growth is in this first 25 years of growth spurt is somewhat smaller than these other 2 countries at least, the scale is enormous. So in terms of scale, it's quite much more impressive than the other countries. The other conventional wisdom that I want to qualify a little bit, the standard story you will hear in the media, both print and electronic, that China's story is an export-led growth. Since we are all impressed by all these products which have been exported from China, made in China, and we believe this story that China's growth is export-led. There is no doubt that China has had a phenomenal increase in exports. But that does not mean that the Chinese growth story is primarily export-driven. If anyone's interested, I can give you the references, but if you look at the data in detail, the result that we'll see is that, say, export played an important role, but not the major role. Even if you take a period of really high global growth in the last decade, say 2002 to 2007, very high rate of growth of exports, even in that period, of the total Chinese growth, exports in value-added terms, by the way. The reason it's important to keep in mind, because people often, when they talk about exports, their export to income ratio, export to GDP, gross domestic product ratio, they're really not doing something legitimate, because the numerator, export, is total output of exports, value output. Denominator is value added. So if you take export value added to denominator, which is GDP, is value added. If you do that, then you see, even in the 2002 to 2007 period, export value added growth contributed about 27% of the total growth. Most of the growth was driven by domestic investment. So China's is by and large a domestic investment driven growth. Export played an important role, but was not the predominant factor. Same, by the way, is true in India, but people usually don't call it an export driven growth anyway for India. Let me now talk about India. Service sector, I already mentioned, is what is the main success stories about India, about the service sector, software, business processing, telecommunication, finance, etc. But here again, I'd urge some sense of proportion. So let me give you some numbers for India. So if you take all the information technology, IT enabled services, so high-tech, IT-related things, software included, business processing, finance, telecommunication, even low-tech end of IT, say call centers and so on. If you add all these people, all these subsectors of service, how many people do they employ? What proportion of the Indian labor force do they employ? So if we add up all of this, taking the very wide definition of IT-enabled services, they employ less than 1/2 of 1% of the Indian labor force. So even if revolutionary changes take place in these sectors, they cannot transform the Indian economy because it's such a tiny, tiny percentage of the Indian labor force. Some people claim, of course, one job in the IT-related sector creates more jobs elsewhere. In fact, the Chamber of Commerce, the IT-related Chamber of Commerce has claimed, I don't know on what basis, but let me not talk about the basis, they have claimed that one job in the IT-enabled sector creates 4 jobs elsewhere in the economy. But if you multiply half of 1% by 4, even that is just 2%. So it's a very tiny percentage of the total Indian labor force. The total Indian labor force now come to about 470 million people. The other thing, let me see if I'm going to tell you anything about the growth story. No, let me come now to, or maybe I'm going to come to poverty and inequality, but as a preface to that, let me tell you just one more thing about the Indian growth. In contrast to Chinese growth in the 1980s and 1990s, less so now. In the 80s and 90s, Chinese growth has been primarily in labor-intensive sectors, which employ a lot of unskilled labor people. What kind of industries? Clothing and garments, shoes, toys, wigs, furniture. Those are the highly labor-intensive, unskilled labor-intensive industries. So I would say initially at least, China is now moving on to more skill-intensive, high-tech, capital-intensive products, but at least in the 80s and 90s, highly labor-intensive. This is quite different from India. India, success stories are all in highly skill-intensive or capital-intensive industries. Example, software, highly skill-intensive industry, telecommunication. Even in manufacturing, India has done very well in pharmaceutical industry. But pharmaceutical is highly skill-intensive, highly intensive in research and development. So India has done well in skill-intensive. The problem with skill-intensive products is that they employ people like you and me, not the poor, unskilled, which is the masses of people in India, masses of workers in India are highly unskilled. So this makes a difference. So you will see Chinese growth has made a big dent in poverty, not the Indian growth, because Indian growth has not been that unskilled labor intensive. So with that introduction, let me go into poverty and inequality. Of course, these two countries generate their own poverty numbers. These are based on them, but these are not exactly those. This is the World Bank. I'm using the World Bank figures because they're at least trying to compare countries, so they will be comparable. And at 2005 PPP, purchasing power parity, which essentially, those who are not familiar with PPP, is the way to make prices comparable between countries. So price differences are somewhat accounted for. So let me take the $1 a day per capita. By the way, World Bank now uses $1.25, but let me stick to the earlier $1 a day poverty line per capita. So the top panel gives you the percentage of population, the bottom total number of people. So over less than a quarter century, I want you to draw 3 lessons from these 2 panels. The first 2 are well known, the third is not so. So the first one is percentage of population between 1981 and 2005. You see decline from 73.5% of the population below that $1 a day poverty line in 81. In 2005, it's in single digit. This is a dramatic change. I happen to believe, and I don't have time to go into that, this 73.5 is probably an overestimate of poverty. But let me take things as they are. So it's a dramatic. India also has a significant decline in poverty from 42% to 24%, but it's not as dramatic as China's. Second message. Bottom panel will give you the absolute numbers of people. So China again, India is not that significant because India's population has been growing quite fast compared to China's. But China's is really breathtaking. 1981, 730 million people, 2005, 106. So in less than a quarter century, 624 million people were raised above the poverty line. I don't think ever before in history something of that magnitude in terms of lifting of people above poverty line has happened. Never before in history. So this is an unparalleled achievement on China's part. Third message, which is not so well known. If you read the financial press, or watch financial media, again and again they will repeat something, and by constant repetition it's become an accepted truth that this big decline in poverty, both in China and in India, but more dramatic in China, is largely due to the integration of the 2 economies into the global economy. Or to put it briefly, globalization is the main reason why this tremendous change in poverty happened in the 2 countries, and particularly in China. And of course, compared to India, China was much more globally integrated, both in terms of foreign trade and foreign investment. So globalization is usually assumed to be the main cause. I'm going to seriously qualify this part of the convention of wisdom. This has been now done econometrically, but I'm going to show you just by looking at these numbers you can see that that cannot be the truth. So look at these Chinese numbers of people. I told you 624 million people have been lifted above the poverty line in less than a quarter century. But if you look at the numbers, more than half of that 624 million were already raised by 1987. China really got globally integrated later, from the middle 90s onward, and China became a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. So much of the globalization having an impact on China happened later, whereas more than half of the 624 million already lifted by 87. So what happened in the early part of the 80s in China? Something big must have happened. Yes, something big happened, but that has nothing to do with globalization. And that big thing is what happened in the agricultural sector in China. In countries like India and China, most of the poor are concentrated in agriculture, rural areas in general. So what happens there is a primary determinant of what happens to poverty. China in this period, from 1978-79 onward, had a big institutional change. China moved from the old commune system to what they call the household responsibility system. More simply put, individual farmers, farm families, got the right to cultivate land, not to own land, but to cultivate land. And that was a big change from the earlier commune system. So that institutional change has nothing to do with globalization. But that is not the only thing. People usually sometimes mention this, not in the context of this context, but sometimes people mention this. And there is now a lot of evidence that this contributed a great deal to the agricultural growth in this period. But I want to mention something else. And that to me is often is overlooked. And that is, this also meant, the way China did it, also meant one of history's most substantive land reform. Not just moving from the commune system to the household responsibility, but each family, subject to one or two minor qualifications, got an equal amount of land. So China in this period, 78, 79, 80, in this period had one of the world's most egalitarian land redistribution. Redistribution not of land ownership, but land cultivation rights. And that made a big change to poverty. Because if nothing else works, you can always fall back on that piece of land. And almost everybody had equal amount of land in the rural areas. This is a big difference from India. India to this day, 40 to 50% of rural households are either landless or almost landless. So you have nothing to fall back upon. But China, everybody had something, rural areas have something to fall back upon, so that provided a floor to poverty. And that made a big change to poverty. So that is to do, both of these factors, the institutional change plus the egalitarian redistribution, have to do with land reform in agricultural sector. There are other reasons for agricultural growth. Some people say procurement prices were raised in this period, etc. But none of these have anything to do with globalization. So that's my third message, that much of this dramatic poverty decline in China probably has very little to do with globalization. I think globalization did play a role, but in the later years. When, as I already told you, as China globally integrated, China exported these labor-intensive products, which employed a lot of unskilled people, unlike in India, and that helped China a great deal. But that's in the later period. India also, some decline of poverty has a lot of reasons, but let me mention just one, which is again an agricultural sector change, is the Green Revolution in India. Now it's tapering off, but in the early period, it played a role in the reduction of poverty. Let me now move on to something that is probably not widely known, and this is relating to India. Poverty numbers are usually in terms of income or consumption, total expenditure. But large part of poverty also depends on non-income, non-monetary indicators. What do you have in mind? Education, health-related indicators. And if you look at health and education indicators, India's performance is really, really dismal. In some respects, India today, in education and health, and I'm talking about basic education, I'm talking about basic health, India today is where China was in the beginning of 1970, long before the economic reform. In fact, China's better infant mortality, maternal mortality, child mortality, all these aspects, or literacy, or school dropouts, all these measures, China is not merely better, far better. And they were already better in the beginning of 70. So that tells you that has very little to do with the economic reform. This is, in a sense, is the legacy of the earlier, the Maoist period. So, in fact, in my book title is the same as the title of this talk, Awakening Giants, Feet of Clay. In my book, there's a whole chapter on these social indicators, and I call this the socialist legacy in China. In fact, there are some reasons to believe that having reached that relatively high standard by in poor country context by 1970, China decelerated after economic reform, both in education and in health. So let me give you the example of health. after economic reform, there was de facto privatization, not legally, but not on paper, but de facto. So, for example, if you are ill, fall ill, you can go to the hospital, but they will charge you a huge fee. So, I have seen survey, and I quote some of these surveys in my chapter, the book. Nearly half of the poor people say that when they fall ill, they cannot afford to go to the hospital, even though it's a public hospital. So because of the fees, same thing happened with education, etc. So the Chinese government very, very recently have started to do something about it. Very recently they have installed rudimentary health insurance program. It's not yet spread out to the interior areas. There's also free education up to grade 9. These are more recent measures in response to a lot of protests against the deceleration of the basic health, basic education in China since the early 70s. India's all along has remained this one. India's health, for example, all along has been largely private. About 80% of the incidence of people going to doctors is to private village doctors. Quite often they are quacks or crooks, but that's a major provider of basic health services in the Indian villages even today. So in some of these indicators, as I said, India's performance is dismal. In fact, in some measures, like say, a proportion of underweight children due to malnutrition in India is not merely worse than China, it's worse than many sub-Saharan African countries. So that's something that is a huge problem in China. Same with education. Indians are proud that there are many Nobel Prize winners. Indians are proud there are many brilliant scientists. But what they are not very proud of is that it's also the world's largest country of illiterates. It's the world's largest country of school dropouts. Things like that. So let me skip now. See the clock is running fast, so I'm going to skip. Let me tell you a little bit about inequality. One standard statistical measure of inequality people use is the Gini coefficient. Many of you may be familiar. Those who are not, just keep in mind that Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality. When it's extreme inequality, it's between 0 and 1. The value is between 0 and 1. Extreme inequality, it's 1. When no inequality is 0. Now, to me, the inequality that is more important than inequality of income is inequality of opportunity. You and I may have the same opportunity in life, but if you are more hardworking than I am, if you are more ambitious than I am, you may have a higher income than I have. And people don't mind that. It's not ethically a big issue. What is ethically and economically a big issue is that people have extremely unequal opportunity in life. So if you take these large agrarian countries like China and India, on what does inequality of opportunity depend? I'm not going to use that many more charts. So inequality of opportunity in these countries depend on at least 3 kinds of inequalities. One is inequality of land distribution. How much land your family inherited. 2, more important than land, is inequality of education. How do you measure inequality of education? Very, very crudely. One way to measure inequality of education is everybody write a number. Every adult writes a number, how many years of schooling you had. Then we can work, like in land, how many acres of land we have, we can work out the Gini coefficient of that measure. People have done that. So when you do that, the Gini coefficient in education inequality measured in this crude sense. So for example, In China it is 0.37. In India it's 0.56. And it's much worse than Latin American countries, which is supposed to be highly unequal countries. Brazil, it's 0.39. So education inequality is a huge problem. And this is largely because India has still a very large number of people who are illiterate. Third, apart from land and education, third thing it's dependent on is social status. And that, of course, most people will agree that India is socially more unequal than China because of the caste system, things like that. Although on that front, things are improving in India in terms of social inequality. Let me talk about gender inequality, which may interest you. I'll skip all of this and go into the diagram that I have, the map that I have. So this is a map of China and India. So this gives you gender imbalance, the number of boys per 100 girls in 0 to 6 years. And the darker it is, the more imbalanced, gender imbalanced it is. It's more than 120 boys, these dark areas, more than 120 boys for 100 girls. You see that dark area is huge in China. Correspondingly, India, this dark area in these two states, Punjab and Haryana. So in gender imbalance-wise, gender equity-wise, in terms of child survival ratio, gender survival ratio, female child survival ratio, India is not very good, but India is better than China. But there are other aspects of gender inequality in which China is better, in terms of female literacy as well as female participation in the labor force. Let me quickly go from all this and just mention one or two things. I'll also show you something about environment in a minute. But let me just mention one other thing. In my book, there's a whole chapter on, the title of the chapter is The Dazzling Difference. Anybody who visits China and anybody who visits India, it will be immediate to you how much more developed Chinese infrastructure is. What do I mean by infrastructure? Physical infrastructure, roads, highways, railways, ports, airports, electricity sector. So these are the physical, telecommunication is something I think India is now as good as China. But apart from that, largely mobile phone, India's, in fact, the rate of growth of mobile phone is higher in India now than in China. But other than that, most of the physical infrastructure, China is really way above. And in my book, I discuss why. One is India, the government has a lot more fiscal deficit. Since much of these physical infrastructure, the government has to invest, the government has much less money in India. So that's a pure financial thing. Even though India's saving is quite high, India's saving for a poor country is much higher than the United States. But that doesn't take much doing. But the saving rate, gross saving rate in India is about 33–34%. China, of course, is near 50%, so it's much above. But China's saving, by the way, is mostly at the government level. It's government enterprises, state enterprises, their business saving, corporate saving. If you look at household saving, the household savings rate in India is now slightly above that in China. If anyone is interested, I can tell you why savings rates are so high in poor countries like China and India. Let me not go into that. So going back to infrastructure, so India doesn't have the public resources to invest in infrastructure. But a very important reason is political. So for example, if you think of infrastructure like electricity, if you think infrastructure like irrigation, things like that, come election time in India, Indian politicians, just to pander to the electorate, will announce, if you elect me, I'm going to make your electricity free. if you let me, I'm going to take your irrigation water free. Just imagine what it does to investment in irrigation, investment in electricity. Who is going to invest in this, private or public, when cost recovery is going to be a problem, which is largely politically induced. Things like that are very important in why infrastructure is so much poorer in India. So let me go into environment. In most aspects of environment, water as well as air pollution, bad in both countries, in some respects probably worse in China than India, for the simple reason China has industrial, let me show you this chart. So this is what? This is satellite image of tropospheric nitrogen dioxide emission levels from fossil fuel combustion and biomass burning in whole of Asia, this map. So you can see the redder it is, the worse it is. So you can see Northeast China. This is Southeast China. Contrast that with neighboring Korea. Contrast that with Japan, and of course India. So China's environmental situation is alarming. India's is bad, but nothing so bad as China's. Having said that, let me make two qualifying statements. One is the Chinese government is very much aware of it, and China has been more energetic than most other countries in the world, including the United States, in going for energy efficiency. It has not yet made a big dent, but it is much more active in starting projects toward energy, green technology and energy efficiency. India is nowhere near that. India has also started on it, but reached nowhere near what China has. But India has a very active environmental movement, and that is a big watchdog on any project which has environmental. This is one of the reasons, for example, why projects are it takes a long time in India to start, because you need that very crucial environmental clearance, which is often difficult to get. So my time is running out, so what I'm going to do now is going to move to the second part of my talk. As I mentioned, this will be more controversial. This will be of political economy. So let me tell you a little bit about the nature of capitalism as it is developing in these two countries. Dramatic in some sense, but less interesting in contrast to China, for the simple reason that India has always been private corporate capitalism has been quite vigorous in India for a long time. And in fact, right now in the last 2-3 decades, has been particularly vigorous. And this is also reflected in the capital markets. Capital markets in India are much more vigorous, including the stock market, much more vigorous in India than in China. This is not surprising, because India had a long, continuous history of successful corporate sector, private corporate sector. The Chinese thing is more fascinating, because after all, China is ruled by a communist party. And so, in some sense, one of the great ironies of history is being played out. Arguably, world's most vigorous capitalism is happening, presided over by a communist party. So that's the irony of history, and to which I now turn. So what kind of capitalism? In 1988, private enterprises above 8 employees was not allowed. So China's got far away from that, 1988. The private corporate sector is not as vigorous as in India. So private business sector is not as vigorous, not always corporate. It's not as vigorous in China as in India. The major problem is finance, because state finance is primarily, the state-owned enterprises still get the lion's share of state-provided credit, which is the dominant source of credit. There are informal sources of credit in China. And political connections are important. So in a sense, the Chinese private sector quite often raise capital through what is known as the Guangxi network, from relatives, friends, and other connections. Informal way of raising money. The other way you raise money, you get some state favors, is by having cozy deals with the state. And in fact, some of the most successful private enterprises in China now are run by what people in China would tell you, princelings, sons and daughters and sons-in-laws of party officials. In fact, the state-owned companies themselves sometimes are run by politically powerful families. I'll cite one piece of statistics which is in my book. I saw it in a report prepared by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So in 2007, they wanted to find out how many resident Chinese, not overseas Chinese, resident Chinese are multimillionaires. So that their definition of multimillionaire was those who have more than 100 million yuan, which at that time was about $14 million. How many Chinese residents have that? So 2007, their estimate was a little above 3,000 people, Chinese resident, who they were multimillionaires by this definition. But what struck me, of these 3,300, more than 2,900 were relatives of high-ranking party officials. This is what probably the most respected Chinese economists, senior Chinese economists whom I've met in Tsinghua University in Beijing, Wu Jingliang is his name. He gave me a present of his latest book. He has described publicly this as China's crony capitalism. In fact, he got into trouble because he said so publicly. India also has crony capitalism. There is quite often a cozy relationship between the politicians and the capitalists, but nowhere near what I've seen and I've read about and I've data about in China. In fact, even the Chinese Communist Party's composition is very interesting now. People usually think Communist parties are mostly workers and peasants, not so in China. I've seen an estimate of I looked at the composition of the Chinese party in 2005. Workers and peasants constituted less than 30%, 29% of the total number of members is about 70-something million numbers. 29% of workers and peasants. The rest are businessmen, professionals, and college students. So it's a completely different image of a communist party than one usually has. And the one advantage that, I don't know whether it's advantage, but those successful enterprising capitalists, they have used the state's authoritarian power to move ahead sometimes. So China, in some sectors and some places, some enterprises, have become a kind of not really crony capitalism, it's kind of predatory capitalism. So that's the big issue about the nature of Chinese capitalism as it's developing. In my book, I have a whole chapter on it. Unfortunately, I don't have time. So I'm going to go to the last topic, political economy topic. Let me about essentially democracy and development. So, as governance and accountability is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to say that the relationship between democracy and development is really quite complicated. If you go to China, you see that the Chinese elite, as well as the Chinese government, increasingly propagate, sometimes it's called the Beijing consensus, that particularly in the early stages of development, you need authoritarianism. Authoritarianism helps you. My own position, which I argue in detail in the book, in the last chapter, which is the longest chapter in the book, authoritarianism is neither necessary nor sufficient for economic development. That it's not necessary is illustrated by not merely India, but also in other continents, Botswana in Africa, Costa Rica in Latin America, and so on, which have a sustained democracy and also a reasonably good rate of development. So so authoritarianism is not necessary. That it is not sufficient is easier to see. There are hundreds of authoritarian regimes which have done miserably in terms of economic development. So it's not sufficient. So what is more important, therefore, is trying out to the nuanced relationship between democracy. So there are several advantages democracy has from the point of view of development and disadvantages. So let me quickly mention some of them. Democracies are better able to avoid catastrophic mistakes, such as China's Great Leap Forward and the ensuing Great Famine that killed nearly 30 million people. Some people say it's higher, or a higher estimate, or a massive mayhem in the form of the Cultural Revolution. And once having made mistakes, democracies have also greater healing powers. You heal better with democracy. In general, democracy makes for a better capacity for managing conflicts, which in the long run enables a more stable political environment for development. India's democratic pluralism has provided the means of containing many social conflicts, a capacity which I am not sure China's homogenizing monolithic state has so far acquired. Faced with a public crisis or political shock, the Chinese leadership, which is otherwise so pragmatic, has a tendency to overreact, suppress information, and act heavy-handedly. Democracies in general experience more intense pressure to share the benefits of development among the people and to reduce the human costs of dislocation, thus making development more sustainable. I've already referred to the active environmental movement in India. Democracies also provide more scope for popular movements against capitalist excesses and industrial fallout, such as environmental degradation. In fact, one of the things the way happened in China, in the local government, China in some sense is more decentralized than India. Local officials have a lot more power, but sometimes they misuse this power. Local officials in cahoots with local business indulge in capitalist excesses. What do I mean by capital? Extreme inequality, environmental degradation, safety in mines, safety consumer products, things like those are violated much more easily in China than in India. Democratic open societies provide a better environment for nurturing the development of information and related technologies, a matter of some importance in the current knowledge-driven global economy. Intensive cyber censorship in China may seriously limit some forms of future innovations in the area of information and knowledge-related technology. So these are the advantages of democracy from the point of view of development. But I should hasten to add that I value democracy even if they are not good for development. Because democracy by itself is an end in itself sometimes, it has a value to it. But let me not, I'm using it as an instrumental sense here. So I'm talking about the advantages. Let me not tell you about the disadvantages. In particular, let me talk about one, which has afflicted India a great deal. And that is what I call competitive populism. You see that here in this country as well, but certainly in India. So essentially, what do you mean by populism? To an economist, the simple meaning of populism is short-termism. You emphasize things that will cater to, pander to people, short-run interests, at the expense of long-term interests. That's what I call populism. And competitive populism is, so you announce this little pandering measure, then somebody else will come, another party, another politician will say, oh, I can do better. This way it's a race to the bottom in terms of populist measures. What it does, it hurts long-term development. It hurts long-term investment. I've already given you an example that in competitive populism, politicians say, if I get elected, you will get your electricity free. This has caused havoc in investment, long-term investment in in the electricity sector in India. And I could give you many such examples. So that's what I mean. So let me end by saying that in general there will be the general impression that in two ways I would say Chinese governance is better than India's. One, as I already said, that China is much more decentralized, governance is much more decentralized than India. I talked about the local collusion with the business. That's a bad aspect. But there's a good aspect to it. Apart from usual advantages of decentralization, there's a particular good aspect arising of the way in which Chinese leadership rewards local performance. So suppose you are a local party official managing a local area. Your promotion prospects depend on how fast the local area is growing. So you may be a corrupt person for all you know, but you don't steal too much money. Because if you steal too much money, local area growth will be affected, so your career promotion chances will be affected. This is something that's missing in India. In India, things are largely decided, the promotion chances are largely decided by seniority, not by local performance. So when you get posted in a particular local area, you don't develop stake in the local economy because you don't care. Because what happens to your local economy is not going to help your career promotion chances. This is a big difference in the governance structure of China and India, which works in favor of China against India. The other governance thing that is quite obviously helped China is Chinese leadership, which is not merely pragmatic, is usually can take decisions fast, which is an advantage of authoritarian countries. So if you decide long-term project, you decide immediately. In India, it will take years to come to a decision because there's a whole process through which you have to go, and there will be agitations in the streets against anything you want to do. There are pros, there are cons, so they will get organized on both sides. They will have street battles, there will be battles in parliament. And so in order to take any simple decision, it takes ages in India. And ultimately you end up with a kind of a compromise. But, and this is my last point, what therefore leads to delayed, slow decision making is also something, and this is due to the fractious pluralistic democracy, is also what makes the decisions more legitimate in the eyes of the people. And this legitimacy deficit is a big issue in China. Because earlier, socialism used to be the justification of most measures. No longer. Socialism no longer is the glue for Chinese society. So the leadership depends for its legitimacy on the high rate of economic growth. When I was in China during the financial crisis period of 2008-2009, my Chinese friends were telling me, they were very worried. It says because of the international crisis, if the Chinese rate of growth, they were telling me, if the Chinese rate of growth falls below 8%, the regime will be in big trouble. I joked with them. I said, if the rate of growth falls to 0 in India, nothing will happen to the leadership. Why? Because the leadership does not derive its legitimacy from the rate of growth. It derives its legitimacy from the democratic pluralism. So, in a sense, the Chinese leadership is riding a tiger, which it will find increasingly difficult to dismount, because it has zeroed the attention of people on a particular source of legitimacy which may not be that easy to carry on in future. So in short, what I have told you is that there are problems in both countries, there are big achievements in both countries, but there are also big failures. Most of the failures have to do with what I call accountability failures. Even in a democracy there can be accountability failures. And there are a lot of political uncertainties, there are a lot of structural weaknesses that will cloud the future. So that's why the title of my talk as well as my book is Awakening Giants feet of clay. The feet of clay refer to the structural weaknesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a really terrific seminar. I'd like to open it for questions with privileging students first. I know the faculty are always itching. But please, do we have any brave students?
What role do you see for China's management of its currency in affecting its growth numbers?
Management of currency is not the only, something that I did not have time to discuss, the macro aspects. Management currency is only one of them. By the way, I think the United States is wrong in believing that if China manages its currency, in other words, it raises the price of the yuan, it's going to help the United States. I don't believe that's going to happen in a big way. But in general, the main thing is a rebalancing of the macro economy, of which currency appreciation is only one part. In general, China is, as I already said in my talk, that the major driver is domestic investment, not consumption. In fact, China has excessive consumption, excessive investment compared to consumption. So already problems of excess capacity has come up in investment. Property bubble in real estate is a big problem. It's going to affect the banks. So a lot of people think that the Chinese banks have huge amounts of bad loans coming up in the next few years. So the economy has to be rebalanced more towards consumption, away from investment. If your question is about prediction, or if your question is about normative, what should be done, that's easy. Yes, China should rebalance in these directions. Whether China will successfully do so remains to be seen. I personally believe that the Chinese will somehow manage it. My prediction is that somehow manage it with some costs. But the problem is in China, as I already mentioned, that faced with a big crisis, they have a tendency to suppress information and overreact. And in overreacting to a crisis, I think Chinese regime might go off the rails. That's the big danger of looking at Chinese policy in future. But I'm still hopeful that China will manage it somehow.
We have another student question. Here's your last chance. You may not get in again. Okay, Mike, carry on. Okay, we'll come back to you, sir.
Yeah, my question is, I'm sure you might have addressed this in your book, the question of corruption in relation to the economic growth. I'm sure in India there is always a talk in media that there is a parallel economy which is as good as big as in terms of money growth, corruption. And of late there has been a serious movement going on in India to take note of that in terms of like getting access to Swiss bank accounts, in terms of money. So what are your thoughts?
I'm going to give you a brief answer given the time. But if you're interested on this Indian anti-corruption movement, I've written several pieces now, but the one that I refer you to, there is a very well-known Indian magazine called Outlook magazine. So if you Google my name and articles in the Outlook magazine, you will get a long piece on corruption and the anti-corruption movement. But very briefly, China has also a lot of corruption. And in fact, as I was telling some of my colleagues here over lunch, is that the movements usually think that if they can tighten the screw of punishment, that will solve the problem. I think, yes, punishment should be carefully administered, etc., but that will not be enough. Because there are certain kinds of things which are just installing more severe punishment. China is an obvious counterexample. China, the punishment for corruption is the severest you can think of. They execute people. India is the opposite extreme. India's punishment, even if it is at all carried out, is a slap in the wrist. But in China, executes people. That is not stopped. or reduced corruption very much in China. Because there are some inherent structural reasons why corruption is there. So let me give you an example. Most of the stories in India for which corruption is going up is exactly the same reason sometimes in China. So what has happened, some resources, public resources, example land, example mineral rights, minerals, example oil and gas fields, example telecommunication spectrum. These are allocated by the public authorities. So that, and what has happened, this is a result of economic growth. As a result of economic growth, values have gone up. So the same piece of land, which has been there for centuries, suddenly shot up in value. A lot of money to be made. If there's a lot of money to be made out of the favored allocation, public allocation of something, bribe givers will find a way of getting it done. Most of the anti-corruption movement in India is concentrating on bribe takers, not on bribe givers. One has to look at the structural reasons why bribe givers are interested. And unless you do something about that, just punishing bribe takers is not enough. In fact, I can even give you a perverse logic, economic logic, why punishing bribe takers might even increase corruption. How? So suppose bribe givers are very much interested because they can make all this money, they're very much interested in giving you bribe. So you now go and tell them, look, no, I don't want to dare take a bribe because this government is now installing all this punishment. Then the bribe giver will tell you, okay, I'll take you a risk premium. Something extra which will cover the probability of your being caught. So perversely, the more severe punishment mechanism may increase the size of the bribe. So all I'm saying that I find the movement is much too simplistic. And in fact, the title of the piece that I wrote is called "When Piety is Not Enough to Stop Corruption." Yes, you and I would like to have less corruption. But it's a whole range of issues. Why don't you read my piece in the Outlook magazine?
Thank you. Okay, we'll open it to faculty, but of course we'll still take students.
Yeah, so you showed that there were similar trajectories after a so-called spark in growth in all these countries, and you spoke that China's was this redistribution in cultivation rights. I'm wondering if all those other countries had a similar spark in some sort of wealth redistribution, or what their sparks might have been?
It so happened that those 4 countries, China is one of them, the other 3 countries, exactly that happened. I would not say that is the only source in those countries, because the egalitarian redistribution of land rights that I told you about China is more dramatic in China than in all these 3 other places, Japan, Taiwan, Korea. But there was a significant land reform in all these 3. In Japan, after the Second World War, there was a land reform. Same in Korea, immediately after the Korean War. And same in Taiwan. In fact, Taiwan land reform is the most interesting, because the Kuomintang from mainland China, who did not do much land reform in the mainland, but when they arrived in Taiwan, where the local population was different, in order to get their loyalty, they redistributed land. This was the beginning of the Taiwanese growth. It's not the only reason why Taiwan grew so fast, but land reform is provided a solid. So I agree with you. I think in all those other countries also, at least in the beginning, land reform played an important role.
We're going to let Mike get his question, and then we'll go to Shane.
In late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping turned the Chinese economy around, or at least that's when the big transformation started. And more recently, Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister of India, Western-trained PhD economist, had some influence, presumably. To what extent is that good luck durable? To what extent can we count on favorable...
Good luck regarding the leaders? Okay, good. Manmohan Singh happens to be a good friend of mine, so he is not the only one. He, in a sense, represents a large number of people for a long time, I would say in the beginning of 1970s, have been writing, have been publicly speaking in favor of economic reforms. So in a sense, Manmohan Singh, who's not really a politician, who was essentially a first an academic, the way I came to know him, he and I taught together in the Delhi School of Economics, but then a technocrat. He uses this opportunity in 1991 of an economic crisis. In a sense, economic crisis gave him, or more his prime minister, he was a finance minister at that time, gave him the opportunity to do things which people, at least the intellectuals have been, not all the intellectuals, I would say, more the liberal intellectuals have been clamoring for a long time. So at least in India, I would not say it's a luck of one individual, because he represented a growing sense among a whole group of people. But it is luck in the sense that he could do it, or anybody could do it, because there was a crisis. Now reforms are petering out because other priorities take importance. Deng Xiaoping, since it's an authoritarian system, change of leadership is not done through the deliberative democratic processes. Yes, Deng Xiaoping is a historical phenomenon, and because he suffered in the Cultural Revolution, he reacted. If he did not suffer, I'm not sure what would have happened. So yes, in that sense. But the Deng Xiaoping, to me, is the example of a great Chinese pragmatism. I mean, famous statements that he made, that it does not matter whether the cat is white or black, as long as it catches mouse. So whatever gives the results, whether it's communist, capitalist, etc., essentially that. The other thing is very important in China, and I've discussed this in my book, something that has not worked in India, it has worked in China, is due to Deng Xiaoping. That is, he always emphasized experimental. So something that you think may work, try it out in a small area. And then if it works, expand it. Something about the land household responsibility system, it started in a small region in China of doing it not in the commune way, but in the household responsibility. And it worked wonders. So gradually it spread. Same with the township and village enterprises in the 80s and the early 90s in China, which were industrial enterprises owned and run by the local village collective or township collective. And that worked. First in a small area, then gradually it spread out. Deng Xiaoping has a famous statement. He says, cross the river, filling the stones. Slowly, pragmatically, you feel the stones, which way you can move, which way the water is flowing. That's the way you cross the street, cross the river. This is something difficult to do in India. And I'll give you a simple political reason for it, even if I wanted to. And I'll give you a personal anecdote. 1991 or 92, I was in Beijing, Shanghai, and then I was directly flying to India. So I flew to India, and I happened to be from the state of West Bengal, which until last May was run by a communist party, which was a tremendous admiration for China. So I arrived in the city of Kolkata, and the finance minister happens to be a student of mine from MIT. So I told him, look, China is doing this tremendous experiment in township and village enterprises. A village collective or township collective runs an enterprise. If they make money, most of it they can keep it. And that gives them the incentive to do better, and that's how it worked in China. Not the state-owned companies, but the collectives. So I said, why don't you try this experiment in at least some areas? People are so admiring of China. Try it in 2 or 3 places, see whether it works or not. So this finance minister of West Bengal laughed. He said, do you want me to carry that out? No way. I said, why not? He said, I can tell you what will happen. So if we try this experiment in 1 or 2 places, As long as it makes money, fine. As soon as the business starts not doing so well, what will they do? They will come and surround me in my office. They will not let me go home until I make their jobs permanent. And if I don't, then in my next election, I will not be elected. So, experiments are difficult to carry out because if experiments by its nature, by their very nature, some will succeed, some will not. In China, TVEs, the Township Village Enterprise, some of them failed. But China allowed the failed to go. I mean, you fend for yourself. India, you cannot do that. There will be tremendous democratic and electoral pressure on bailing them out. And so in anticipation, they don't carry out experiments. So this is a structural reason. There's another structural reason. Why could Chinese party could do these experiments even when they failed, they could let them go? My own claim is that even if China is not a democracy, you are not completely insensitive to what's happening to the livelihoods of people. But in China, because of the egalitarian distribution of land rights, anybody who is in a business which failed has something to fall back upon, a piece of land they got. In India, as I already said, nearly half of the rural households don't have this fallback option. So you don't have, so if it fails, you are really desperate. You go and surround the politician until he guarantees you the job. So that's a difference. So Deng Xiaoping did something great, but I think the reason why he succeeded with these things has some background which is more structural in nature.
Oh, thank you. Or, you want to go first?
Yeah, go ahead. No, sorry.
Okay. You started to answer it, so what are your thoughts on the future of improving the inefficiency in the legislative process in India when it comes to issues like, for example, the passing any sort of individual household land reform, such as what you were just talking about? I know it's been brought up before many times, but I just heard that there's a lot of issues with inefficiency when it comes to this legislative process with red tape, where it takes a very long time to make some sort of a decision or come to a decision. There's political pressures, and then there's some sort of compromise maybe in the end. But what do you see in the future, especially in the next 25, maybe 50 years? Is there any hope for any real reform?
Depends on the policy that you have in mind, the land reform policy that you're talking about. The main problem is not administrative, the main problem is political. Because the landed interests, the vested interests which are against the land reform are quite often too politically powerful. They will try to block at every step. So it's a political obstacle rather than administrative. I'm not denying that there exists some administrative, but it's less important. But looking in the future, and this has always been a problem, looking to the future, I'm somewhat hopeful that the new technology will help. So give you an example, land records in many states are now computerized. This was a big problem. So you own a piece of land, but in order to prove that it is your land, it's going to give you 10, 12 years to get the piece of paper, you have to bribe people. It's not just quite often it's a matter of corruption, inefficiency that we are talking about. Nobody could trace that land record. It's probably, last time it was transferred probably was 1932. So you can't find that piece of paper, lots of problems, that's an inefficiency. Increasingly, this thing will be computerized. So, for example, I inherited a small house from my father when he died in my part of India. And I was surprised by how quickly I could get the piece of paper. Because it is a laborious process, but still I was surprised. I anticipated more time. It's because it was computerized. And that also will lead to, the technology will also not eliminate, but I think partially solve the problem of corruption. Because once it's computerized and it's on the website, the number of intermediaries through whom you have to go is fewer. So I'm a little hopeful that way. And the other hopeful thing is that India, in spite of all the problems, has a very vigorous NGO movement. All these voluntary movements. There are a lot of voluntary movements, including anti-corruption movements. So over time, this will have an impact.
Maybe we can abuse human nature and take one of the questions Sardars has in that, and then we'll have to go to an individual,
Sure.
because we're really.
In your speech, you are not paying attention to, in household responsibility system in China, and you are not punctuating on pricing reform, which is, as we know, a dual-track pricing system and government procurement, and giving such kind of incentives, which is actually what brought these reforms to be effective in China.
I actually discussed that in my book, that the dual-track system was there in the beginning. It was more a transitional system. But then later it became full one-track. But the dual-track system is a good transitional way for moving from the command system to the market system. But it's a transition. And in the transition process, generally lots of corruption. Because whenever they have a dual-track system, one dependent on the market price, and the other is a control price, you can imagine the incentive to get it in the lower price, sell it in the open market. This is the incentives are too strong. So dual track system after a point becomes too corrupt. And gradually, but as I said, most countries it is used more as a transitional, and China it acted in that way, but over time that is now gone away. It's now mostly, except for certain sectors, transport, finance, energy. These are the sectors which are still in state hands, but most of the prices are market prices in China.
I think we'll have to thank Professor Bardhan for a great seminar.